Dr. Orion Hale was used to emergencies. As the only physician on a research station located at the edge of known space, he had seen it all: mining accidents, strange illnesses, and the occasional radiation leak. But nothing prepared him for the crash that would change everything. On a quiet evening, when the station's systems hummed and the stars outside the observation windows sparkled like scattered diamonds, a loud, violent crash shook the entire station. Alarms blared, red lights flashing throughout the hallways. Orion's heart raced as he grabbed his medkit and sprinted toward the source of the disturbance. His mind raced with questions. Was it an asteroid strike? A ship malfunction? Nothing could have prepared him for the wreckage he was about to encounter. Rounding the corner, Orion nearly collided with a group of station engineers already at the scene. They were huddled around what appeared to be a large, smoking, twisted piece of metal, far too alien to be human-made. The ship's remains were glowing faintly in the dark, strange markings etched across its surface, glowing as if alive. His eyes widened as he caught sight of what lay just beyond the wreckage. An unconscious figure. She was unlike any creature Orion had ever seen. The alien woman was sprawled out on the cold metal floor, her body bruised and bloodied from the crash. Her long limbs seemed unnaturally graceful, but they were twisted at odd angles, and her skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, displaying strange patterns that seemed to change as she breathed. Despite her injuries, her face retained a sense of regal authority, her high cheekbones and sharp jawline betraying a warrior's toughness. But it was her eyes, glowing faintly with an inner fire, that captured Orion's attention most. They were fierce, defiant, yet somehow filled with pain. She wasn't just a fighter. This was a woman with a story, a life. Get her to the medical bay now. Orion barked to the engineers. He moved quickly, kneeling by her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to focus. He was a doctor, not a soldier, and his job was to save lives. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Gently, he checked for a pulse, relieved to find one. Though weak, she was breathing, but her injuries were severe. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and her body temperature was dropping rapidly. He didn't know how much time they had. The doctors on the station had dealt with alien injuries before, but this wasn't like the typical research outpost injuries he had handled. This was something entirely different. He barked orders, urging the engineers to assist him as they carefully lifted her and transported her to the medical bay. As they moved down the hallways, Orion's mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had happened to her ship? He had so many questions, but right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her stable. Once in the medical bay, Orion quickly set to work. His hands moved efficiently as he ran a scanner over her body, assessing the damage. Multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, a concussion, and severe burns. But it was the strange energy readings coming from her body that caught his attention. The scanner beeped in warning. There was something different about her, something beyond her alien physiology. It wasn't just her species. Something in her blood, something in her cells, was unlike anything he had seen before. He leaned closer, studying her face once again. Her expression was still one of defiance. Even in unconsciousness, she wasn't afraid. She was strong, stronger than most people Orion had known, human or otherwise. Despite her weakened state, she gave off a sense of power, as if she could stand and fight again at any moment. "Who are you?" Orion whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He would soon find out. But for now, his priority was saving her life. The alien woman's injuries were severe, but Orion had always been a healer, always able to save those who needed help. He wouldn't fail her, not now, not when she was so close to death. The sound of the medical bay doors opening startled him, and he looked up to find a station commander standing in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "Dr. Hale," the commander said, "what in the galaxy happened here? Who is she?" Orion glanced at the unconscious woman on the table, his eyes narrowing. He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. This woman, whoever she was, would change everything. And Orion Hale was about to discover a side of humanity he had never expected. Dr. Orion Hale spent the next few hours monitoring the alien woman's condition. The medical bay was quiet except for the steady beep of machines and the occasional hum of the station's ventilation system. He checked her vitals again and again, carefully administering painkillers and bandages, his thoughts focused entirely on her survival. Her wounds were serious, and the unknown energy readings coming from her body puzzled him. She was unlike any species he had ever encountered, and that made her injuries all the more difficult to treat. But as a doctor, he was used to adapting. The challenge didn't scare him, it fascinated him. Orion looked down at her unconscious form. Her long limbs were still, her body covered in strange markings that seemed to shift in the dim light of the medical bay. He couldn't help but wonder where she came from, what kind of world she had known before crashing on his station. He had no answers, but he had to find some way to help her. When she finally began to stir, Orion was by her side immediately. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the low light. At first, they were confused, then wary, scanning the room as if trying to assess her surroundings. Slowly, she pushed herself up, wincing in pain. Her muscles were stiff, and her movements were slow, but her strength was undeniable. Despite her injury, there was no hint of fear in her eyes, only defiance. She looked at Orion with suspicion. "Where am I?" Her voice was low and raspy, but the strength behind it was clear. "You're on a research station," Orion replied calmly. "You were hurt, and I helped you. You've been unconscious for a while, but you're recovering." He offered her a soft smile, hoping to put her at ease, though he knew she wouldn't trust him easily. Her eyes narrowed, studying him carefully. She was beautiful, but in a fierce, almost dangerous way. The markings on her face, though strange, gave her an aura of authority. Orion didn't know where she came from, but he could tell she wasn't just anyone. This was a woman who had lived through battles, who had known loss, and who had fought to survive. He sensed the weight of her past, even in the few moments they had shared. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice now sharper. "I can heal myself." Orion's brow furrowed. "You're still weak. You've been injured badly. You're not in any condition to fight or heal on your own." The woman's gaze turned cold. "I didn't ask for your help, human." Her tone stung, but Orion kept his composure. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to help. He'd seen this before, the defensive wall that many people put up when they were vulnerable. But this woman wasn't just any patient. She was an alien warrior who had just crash-landed on a human station, and her pride was just as injured as her body. Orion could see that now. "I understand," he said softly. "But right now, your best chance of recovery is to let me treat you. I'm not asking you to trust me, but please, just let me help you." For a long moment, she stared at him in silence, her expression unreadable. Orion didn't know what she was thinking, but he sensed that every word, every action, was a test for her. She was trying to decide whether she could trust him, and that trust didn't come easily. It never did for someone who had fought as long and as hard as she had. Finally, she relaxed her posture, just a little. "Fine. But when I'm healed, I'm leaving." Orion nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But right now, you need rest." She lay back down, her expression still tense but less hostile. Orion was relieved, but he knew it wasn't the end of their struggle. The woman wasn't about to surrender her independence easily, and he wasn't sure if she would ever truly trust him. But that wasn't his goal. His goal was to keep her alive, to heal her body, and maybe, in time, to earn a little bit of that trust. As the hours passed, Orion kept a close watch on her, adjusting her treatment and keeping her stable. Though she didn't speak much, he could tell she was aware of everything happening around her. And while she might not have trusted him, she was learning, just as he was. He was learning that this woman was no ordinary patient. She was a warrior, a survivor, and despite everything, she was still willing to fight for her life. And that, in its own way, was something to respect. But Orion knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge was still to come, earning her trust, learning who she was, and discovering why she had crashed on this station. And somewhere along the way, Orion knew that their fates would become intertwined in ways neither of them could predict. The days passed slowly, with Dr. Orion Hale tending to Yalara's wounds, carefully monitoring her progress, and learning what little he could from the alien warrior. She was still distant, guarded, but Orion had come to understand that this was simply how she was. Her body was healing, but her spirit was a different matter. Yalara's eyes were filled with shadows, haunted by a past she wouldn't talk about. Every time Orion tried to ask, she shut him down with a curt remark or a piercing gaze that made it clear she wasn't interested in sharing her story. One afternoon, as Orion adjusted the medical devices that were helping to heal her internal injuries, he noticed her staring out of the small observation window. The stars were scattered across the black void, twinkling like distant beacons. Yalara seemed lost in thought, her face blank but tense. There was something about the way she looked at the stars that made Orion curious. She wasn't just gazing at the vastness of space. There was a sadness in her eyes, a longing. "Yalara, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Orion said gently, his voice quiet. "But I can see there's something weighing on you. Whatever happened out there, you don't have to carry it alone." She didn't respond immediately, but Orion could see her grip tighten on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he thought she might snap at him, just like she always did, but this time, something in her expression shifted. There was a vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of pain and frustration. "I didn't ask for your sympathy, Doctor," she said, her voice low and almost broken. "I don't need your pity." Orion didn't flinch. "It's not pity, Yalara. It's concern. You've been through something terrible, and I'm just trying to help. I'm not here to judge you." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like she might shut him out again. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "My people were torn apart by a war," Yalara began, her voice thick with emotion. "For centuries, we fought, and in the end, it all means nothing. My family, my brothers and sisters, they died. My leaders abandoned us. We were left to fight and die in a war that we could never win." She paused, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving the pain all over again. "I was one of the last to survive. I had no choice but to keep fighting. And now I'm alone, lost, with no one left to fight for." Orion watched her as she spoke, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. She had been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a woman who had seen the destruction of her entire world, the loss of everything she had fought for. He could see it in her eyes now, the shattered pieces of a soul that had been broken by war, by betrayal, by survival. "I'm sorry," Orion said softly, unsure of what else to say. "I can't imagine what that must have been like, but I want you to know that you're not alone here. I'm not going anywhere." Yalara didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained locked on his, searching for something in his gaze. Maybe she was trying to figure out if she could trust him, or if his words were just empty. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I don't trust easily," she said, "and I don't let people close. I've had to learn to rely on no one but myself." Her voice broke slightly as she added, "But maybe you're different." Orion's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't sure if she meant them, or if she was just grasping at something to hold on to. But in that moment, he realized that his job wasn't just to fix her body. It was to help heal the damage that ran far deeper than physical wounds. She needed someone to show her kindness, to remind her that there was more to life than fighting, more to her than just a warrior. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Orion said quietly. "But I'm here for you. If you ever need to talk, or if you just need someone to listen, I'm here." Yelara's expression softened just a little, though her walls were still high. She didn't know what to make of him yet, but for the first time since waking up, she didn't push him away. She simply nodded, her voice almost imperceptible as she whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but to Orion, it felt like a breakthrough. Yelara wasn't ready to share her past fully, but maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let go of some of the walls she had built around her heart. And as a doctor, he would do everything in his power to help her heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. He had no idea where this journey would lead, but one thing was clear: the bond between them was only just beginning to form. And that bond would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Yelara's condition improved steadily. Dr. Orion Hale continued to tend to her injuries, but now their interactions were different. There was a quiet understanding between them, a connection that neither could fully explain. Yelara, once cold and distant, had begun to soften, just a little. She still kept much of her past to herself, but she didn't shut him out the way she had in the beginning. When she was awake, they would talk. At first, their conversations were brief, focused on the basics: her treatment, her recovery, and the few details she was willing to share about her past. But as time passed, the walls between them started to come down. Yelara would sometimes speak about her home planet, though the memories were clearly painful for her. She would tell Orion about the customs of her people, their traditions, and the bond they shared with the land. Her voice would grow softer when she spoke of her family, and though her words were laced with grief, Orion could see how much she missed them. Despite everything, Yelara still held on to the hope that someone, might be left of her world. One day, after a long treatment session, Yelara finally spoke of the war that had ravaged her people. Her voice was quiet, but there was strength in it. She spoke of the violence, the battles that never seemed to end, and the endless struggle for survival. The war had taken everything from her: her family, her comrades, and her sense of safety. But through it all, Yelara had held on to the belief that she was meant to survive. She was meant to fight. But now, in the quiet of this research station, her purpose had shifted. The desperation in her eyes had begun to fade, replaced by something that resembled peace, or perhaps the beginning of it. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent my whole life fighting. And now, I don't know what to fight for anymore." Orion listened intently, not interrupting. He understood. He had spent his life as a healer, saving people, easing their pain. But he had never known what it was like to lose everything, to have a purpose shattered beyond repair. He couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be a warrior without a war. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Orion said softly. "I know you're used to being strong, to always having a purpose. But maybe it's okay to not have all the answers for once. Maybe it's okay to heal, to take a step back and just breathe." Yelara looked at him, her glowing eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, to Orion's surprise, Yelara leaned back against the pillow, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, her tone almost uncertain. It was a rare vulnerability, one that Orion hadn't seen in her before. "But I don't know how to stop fighting." "You don't have to stop fighting," Orion replied. "But you don't have to fight alone either. I'm here." Yelara's gaze softened, just a fraction, and for the first time, Orion saw the weight of the pain in her eyes, the burden of a lifetime of conflict and loss. It wasn't just her body that needed healing, it was her soul. And while Orion had always been trained to heal the physical, he now realized that healing the emotional scars would be just as important, if not more so. "I don't understand humans," Yelara said after a pause, her voice tinged with curiosity. "You live so differently from us. Your world isn't filled with constant war, with death at every corner. How do you keep going? Orion smiled softly, glad she was asking questions, glad she was letting herself be curious. We don't always have it figured out, he said, but we find reasons to keep going. We find things worth fighting for, even if they seem small. Love, family, the hope that things can get better. And sometimes we have to trust each other, even when it's hard. Yelara's gaze shifted away from him, as if she were contemplating his words. She had always fought alone, relying on her own strength, her own instincts. She had never known the kind of support that Orion spoke of, the kind of trust that bound people together. She had never been allowed that luxury. Her entire existence had been built around survival and trust. But for the first time in a long while, Yelara felt something stirring inside her. A seed of doubt, perhaps, or the possibility of something different. Maybe there was more to life than war and loss. Maybe there was something worth fighting for, something other than just survival. Orion watched her carefully, sensing the change in her. He knew that healing, true healing, would take time. But for the first time, he felt hopeful that Yelara could begin to find peace, if not in the absence of fighting, then in the possibility of new beginnings. We'll figure it out, Orion said softly, his voice reassuring. Together. It had been weeks since Yelara had opened up to Dr. Orion Hale, and in that time, something remarkable had begun to happen. The once fiercely independent warrior, who had fought tooth and nail to stay isolated from everyone, had slowly started to change. She no longer recoiled at his presence or shut him out with sharp words. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The walls she had carefully built around herself were beginning to crack. Not that Yelara had fully let her guard down. No, she still had that warrior's resolve. But there were moments now where she allowed herself to be vulnerable, even if only for a brief time. One afternoon, Orion found her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring out of the small observation window. The stars glimmered in the distance, but Yelara's gaze seemed distant, lost in thought. He had come to check on her, as usual, but as he approached, he noticed something different. She wasn't scowling or avoiding eye contact. She was simply present. He hesitated, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace between them, but he also couldn't ignore the opportunity to connect. Yelara. Orion spoke softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was no aggression in them, just a quiet acknowledgement. I was just thinking, she said, her voice uncharacteristically calm. About everything. About what happens after this. After I leave this place. Orion took a seat nearby, sensing that this was a rare moment of reflection for her. You're still healing, he said gently. There's no rush to figure everything out right now. Yelara let out a sigh, one that sounded heavier than usual. I thought I was done fighting, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I could walk away from it all. But there's still a part of me that's not at peace, a part of me that feels like I'm running away. Orion nodded, understanding more than she realized. It's not easy to stop being what you've always been. You're a warrior, Yelara. But that doesn't mean you have to keep fighting the same fight. She turned her head fully toward him, her gaze searching. What if I don't know how to fight for anything else? What if I can't find another purpose? The question hung in the air, a heavy silence filling the space between them. Yelara had spent so much of her life surviving, fighting for causes that didn't always make sense, just to stay alive. She had never truly questioned her purpose, until now. You don't have to find it all at once, Orion said, his voice firm but compassionate. You can take it one step at a time. Find something small to fight for, something that matters to you. It doesn't have to be the same as before, and you don't have to do it alone. Yelara's eyes flickered, a trace of emotion passing through them. She had spent so long relying only on herself that the thought of relying on someone else was foreign to her. But for the first time, she allowed herself to consider it, not as a weakness, but as a possibility. She wasn't sure what it meant, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to embrace it, but the idea of having someone by her side, someone who genuinely cared, was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice a mix of uncertainty and quiet resolve. "But I'm trying." Orion smiled warmly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and hope. "That's all anyone can do. Just try." The conversation shifted as they began to discuss her recovery, and Orion continued his routine of caring for her injuries. But something was different. It wasn't just the healing of physical wounds. It was the beginning of a deeper transformation. Yalara was beginning to see that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. She didn't have to fight without a cause. And though she wasn't ready to let go of everything she had been, she was starting to understand that she didn't have to be defined solely by her past. She could choose what came next. The days that followed brought small but significant changes. Yalara began to show interest in the things around her. She spent more time learning about the research station, asking Orion questions about the different species and technologies. She started to participate in the daily routines, not as a patient, but as someone who was beginning to take ownership of her future. She was still cautious, still wary. And as for Orion, he was beginning to see the woman beneath the warrior, the person who had been through unimaginable loss, and yet still had the strength to seek something more. She wasn't just the alien who had crashed on his station. She was a survivor, a fighter, and someone who, despite everything, was willing to take a chance on something new. For the first time in a long while, Orion felt like they were both on a path toward healing, toward finding a way to move forward together. It had been a month since Yalara's arrival at the research station, and the changes in her were undeniable. Though she was still the warrior who carried the weight of her past with her, she had become more open, more willing to share bits of herself with Dr. Orion Hale. It was small progress, but it was progress nonetheless. For the first time, she was beginning to trust him, not just as the doctor who patched her up, but as someone who was starting to become a part of her new life, someone she could rely on, even if only a little. One evening, after Orion finished his rounds, he found Yalara sitting near the station's small garden, her gaze focused on the alien plants that swayed gently in the artificial breeze. She had spent more time outside recently, staring at the stars or tending to the plants, as if she were trying to find a piece of peace among the chaos of her mind. She didn't acknowledge his presence at first, but Orion knew she wasn't trying to shut him out. She had simply learned to find solace in her own company. "Are you still wondering what's out there?" Orion asked, his voice soft as he approached her. Yalara turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. It wasn't the guarded stare she had used to give him, but rather a look of curiosity, as if she was considering the question for the first time. "I've been thinking about what you said," she replied, her voice steady but still tinged with uncertainty. "About finding something worth fighting for." Orion raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what did you decide?" Yalara hesitated for a moment, as though she were gathering the courage to admit something she hadn't allowed herself to say before. "I don't know if I'm ready to stop fighting," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I could fight for something else. Maybe I could fight for the chance to start over, to make a life beyond the war." Orion smiled warmly, moved by her words. He knew it wasn't easy for her to let go of everything she had known, but it was a step, a big one. "That's a powerful choice," he said gently, "and I think it's one you're more than capable of making." Yalara's gaze softened, just a little. She still wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like there might be a future to consider. She had spent so much of her life fighting and surviving, but now she was starting to think about living. She wasn't ready to fully embrace the idea, but it was becoming clearer to her that there was more to life than endless conflict. As the days went by, Yalara's relationship with Orion deepened. She began to trust him more, not just as a doctor, but as a person. She found herself sharing more, little by little. She would ask him questions about Earth, about his life before the station, and what it was like to be part of a peaceful world. Orion, for his part, was patient with her. He never pushed too hard, never made her feel like she had to share more than she was comfortable with. Instead, he simply listened and offered small pieces of advice when she needed it. One evening, while Orion was working on some equipment in the lab, Yellara entered the room, hesitating in the doorway. "Orion," she began, her voice uncertain but steady. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from his work and nodded, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Yellara stepped into the room, her posture slightly tense. "I've been thinking about what you said about trust. I've never really trusted anyone before, not like this. But I think I'm starting to trust you. I don't know if that means anything, but it's something." Orion put down his tools, surprised but grateful for her honesty. "It means a lot to me, Yellara. You don't have to explain more than that if you're not ready. Trust is earned, and I'm glad you're starting to trust me." Yellara nodded, her gaze dropping for a moment as if she were processing the weight of her own words. She had never been one to open up, but now she was starting to understand that trust didn't have to be as fragile as she had once thought. She could trust again. Not. As the evening wore on, they continued their conversation, with Yellara slowly opening up more about her past, her fears, and her hopes for the future. She wasn't ready to fully embrace the idea of a new life, but she was beginning to realize that it was possible, and for someone who had spent so long surviving, that was a huge step. Orion could see the change in her. He could see the quiet strength that she had always carried, the same strength that had allowed her to survive the unthinkable. It wasn't gone. It was evolving. And as they talked late into the night, Orion felt hopeful for the future. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but for the first time, he felt like they were both on the same path, taking steps toward healing. And maybe a future that didn't have to be defined by the past. As the days passed, Yellara's recovery took another turn. Her body had healed faster than anyone had expected, thanks to Dr. Orion Hill's careful treatment and her own unyielding will. But it wasn't just her body that was recovering now. It was her spirit. Each day, she took small steps toward finding the person she wanted to become. Still, there were moments of doubt. Moments when the shadow of her past would creep back into her mind, filling her with fear and uncertainty. One evening, as Orion was preparing some supplies in the medical bay, Yellara approached him, a determined look in her eyes. She was silent at first, just standing there in the doorway, watching him. He glanced up, sensing the change in her posture. This was different. She wasn't there for treatment or routine checkups. There was something else on her mind. "Orion," Yellara said, her voice steady, but tinged with an unspoken challenge. "I need to test myself." Orion paused, his hand stilling. He met her gaze, instantly recognizing the look in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen countless times before in warriors, soldiers, and people who had spent too much of their lives running from their fears. It was the look of someone who needed to confront their past, even if it meant stepping into something unknown. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone gentle but cautious. Yellara stepped into the room fully, her hands clasped together in front of her. "I've been hiding behind the idea that I'm not ready to face the world outside this station. But I think I need to prove to myself that I can do more than just survive. I need to face what's out there. I can't keep running." Orion's heart tightened. He knew how difficult this must be for her. Yellara had been through hell, and yet here she was, wanting to push herself further. He understood the need to face one's fears. He had his own battles, his own demons, but he also understood that healing wasn't a race. It was a journey. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Orion asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "The outside world isn't as simple as just stepping out. You've been through a lot, Yellara. I don't want you to rush this." Yellara's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet intensity behind her words. "I've always rushed. I've always been in motion, fighting, running, hiding. I can't do that anymore. I need to know what it's like to live beyond that. to trust that there's more to life than fear. Orion studied her, his heart aching for the pain she had carried for so long. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a person who had been robbed of her peace, her family, and her home. She had spent years fighting for a cause that had ultimately torn everything apart. And now, in this quiet corner of the galaxy, she was starting to understand that there was more to life than just survival. He took a deep breath, weighing her request. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "If you feel ready, we'll take it slow. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll be with you." Yellara nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. She hadn't expected Orion to understand, let alone offer to stay by her side. But he had always been there for her, in ways she couldn't fully explain. He had become more than just a doctor. He was someone who believed in her when she hadn't believed in herself. The next day, they made their way to the airlock. Orion had prepared everything for Yellara's first venture outside the station. Nothing too risky, just a small excursion to get her accustomed to the outside world. He had no idea what she was thinking or feeling, but he could see the resolve in her steps. She was determined, even if she was still uncertain about what came next. As the airlock door opened, Yellara took her first steps outside the station. The cold vacuum of space stretched out before her, a vast and infinite expanse that was both beautiful and terrifying. She felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Orion was by her side, guiding her, reminding her that she didn't have to face the world alone. Slowly, as the moments passed, Yellara's breathing began to steady. Her steps became more confident, each one a testament to the strength she had hidden deep within her. She wasn't just walking in the vacuum of space, she was walking toward something new, toward a future where she didn't have to keep fighting every day. When they finally returned to the station, Yellara's steps were lighter. Her shoulders were no longer tense, and the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She had done it. She had stepped into the unknown and lived to tell the tale. Orion watched her, pride swelling in his chest. This was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, Yellara was ready to take it, and Orion knew that, no matter what happened, he would be there beside her every step of the way. In the days following Yellara's first steps outside the station, something inside her shifted. She had faced the void of space and lived through it, and that experience had opened her eyes to a world of possibilities she had long thought were closed off to her. The walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling, brick by brick, and it scared her. It wasn't just the physical fear she had once known in battle. It was the fear of change, of letting go of the old ways and embracing something uncertain, something softer. It was the fear of truly healing. Orion noticed the shift in Yellara's demeanor. She was more relaxed now, but there were still moments when he saw the wariness in her eyes, the way she would flinch when someone made too sudden a movement. She was trying, but she wasn't quite ready to fully trust the peace she was beginning to build. And that was okay. Change was a slow process, especially for someone like her, who had lived so long in survival mode. One morning, Orion found Yellara standing in the station's observation room, staring at the stars. She had done this more often in the past few days, as though the vastness of the universe was calling to her. As if by looking at the stars, she could figure out where she belonged in all of this. He approached her quietly, not wanting to disturb her thoughts, but knowing she needed something. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel it in the air. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, standing a few steps behind her. Yellara didn't turn to face him right away. Her voice was distant, almost contemplative. "I've been thinking about everything we've talked about what it means to heal, to change." Orion waited, sensing she wasn't done. "And what did you come up with?" "I don't know," she said after a pause, finally turning to look at him. "I feel like I've been running for so long from the war, from the pain, from everything that happened. But now it's like I'm standing still, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." Orion nodded, his expression understanding. He knew what it was like to feel caught between two worlds, the one you're trying to leave behind and the one you're trying to build. It's okay to feel unsure, he said gently. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a journey with a lot of twists and turns. Yelara shook her head, frustration flickering across her face. I've been told that my whole life. You'll heal in time. You'll get over it. But every time I think I'm ready, the past comes back. The pain. The guilt. I don't know how to let go of that. Orion's heart ached for her. He had always seen her as strong, but now he understood that her strength wasn't about pushing through pain. It was about surviving it. And survival, while necessary, wasn't the same as living. You don't have to let go all at once, Orion said carefully. You can let go piece by piece, and maybe there will always be some parts of your past that stay with you. But that doesn't mean you can't find peace. You can still have a future, Yelara. You don't have to carry the weight of everything forever. Her eyes softened as she listened, and for the first time, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the weight of the world lifting off her shoulders in that moment, but something else. Something gentler. A recognition that she didn't have to have it all figured out. She didn't have to be perfect. She could move forward, even if it was slow, even if it meant stumbling along the way. I think I'm tired of fighting, she said quietly, her voice filled with an honesty that surprised even her. Not fighting the way I used to, but fighting with myself. Maybe I don't have to be a warrior all the time. Orion smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. You don't have to be. You've been fighting for so long, Yelara. It's okay to rest, to rebuild. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Yelara allowed herself to breathe without feeling like she had to carry the entire universe on her shoulders. She wasn't ready to forget her past, and she didn't need to. But she could choose how to carry it, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could allow herself to build something new, something worth living for. The silence that followed was comfortable, peaceful. They stood there for a long moment, looking out at the stars. Yelara didn't have all the answers, and she didn't expect them to come rushing in. But she could see the possibility of a future where she didn't have to run anymore. A future where she could heal, at her own pace, with someone who understood her. As they turned to leave the observation room, Yelara felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear wasn't gone, but it was no longer controlling her. She didn't have to face the unknown alone. Orion was right beside her, every step of the way. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Days turned into weeks, and the changes in Yelara became more evident. With each passing day, she seemed to shed more of the weight she had carried for so long. The emotional scars from her past battles were still there, but they no longer defined her. She was learning to live again, not just survive. And it was all thanks to Orion's patience, his unwavering support, and his belief in her when she couldn't believe in herself. One evening, as the station's artificial sunset bathed the walls in warm orange hues, Yelara found herself in the medical bay again. But this time, she wasn't there for treatment. She was there to help. Orion had been overwhelmed with his duties lately, as more injured travelers from different corners of the galaxy had passed through the station. It was a lot for one person to handle, but Yelara had insisted on doing her part. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was someone with a purpose, someone who could give back. Orion watched as she moved through the room, preparing supplies, cleaning instruments, and checking on the injured. He could see the confidence in her actions, the way she handled everything with care and precision. It reminded him of the first time he had seen her, the fear, the uncertainty in her eyes. Now she was a completely different person. She had transformed, and he was in awe of how far she had come. Yelara, Orion said, his voice soft but filled with pride. You're doing great. Yelara glanced up from the patient she was tending to, a small smile tugging at her lips. I've had a lot of practice with healing, she said, her voice light but sincere. But this feels different. It feels like I'm finally doing something that matters. Orion nodded, his heart swelling with admiration. He had known from the start that Yalara had something special in her, a strength, a resilience, a will to survive. But now he saw something even more powerful in her, the ability to heal others, to give back, and to build something positive out of the ashes of her past. As they worked together, side by side, the connection between them grew stronger. It was more than just a doctor-patient relationship now. It was friendship, partnership, and something that neither of them could quite define yet. But it was real, and it was enough. Later that evening, after the last of the patients had been treated, and the station had settled into its quiet hum, Yalara and Orion sat together in the observation room once more. This time, there was no pressure, no need to talk about the past or the future. It was just two people, enjoying the peaceful silence that filled the space around them. The stars outside sparkled like 1,000 possibilities, and Yalara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "I never thought I'd be able to do this," Yalara said quietly, her voice filled with wonder. "To feel at peace. To feel like maybe I'm not broken." Orion turned to look at her, his eyes soft. "You're not broken, Yalara. You're just human. We all have our battles, our scars. But that doesn't mean we're not whole. You've come so far, and you're still growing." Yalara smiled, a genuine smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm ready to face it. With you." Orion's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air between them, and in that moment, he knew that they had both found something they hadn't been looking for. They had found healing, understanding, and a bond that went deeper than either of them had anticipated. "Whatever comes next," Orion said softly, "we'll face it together. You're not alone, Yalara. Not anymore." Yalara nodded, her gaze turning back to the stars outside. The universe was still vast, still unpredictable, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could handle whatever it had in store for her. With Orion by her side, she knew that she could rebuild her life, one step at a time. And as the stars shimmered in the distance, Yalara knew that her journey was just beginning. The days that followed brought more change, but this time, it was a change that Yalara welcomed with open arms. The healing process she had begun, both physical and emotional, was still ongoing, but it wasn't the same journey she had been on before. There was no rush now. She no longer viewed the world through the lens of a soldier always preparing for the next battle. Instead, she was learning to embrace each moment, to find peace in the present, and to trust in the new relationships she was forming. Orion had become more than just the doctor who had saved her life. He was a steady presence, someone who had shown her that kindness didn't have to be a weakness. It could be strength, a quiet strength that healed without the need for weapons or battles. Together, they had built something simple, but meaningful: trust. One evening, as the station drifted silently through space, Yalara found herself in the medical bay once again. This time, however, it wasn't to treat an injury or to assist Orion. It was her turn to sit quietly, to reflect on everything that had happened. She had never allowed herself the luxury of quiet moments like this, but now they felt like a gift. She stared at the glowing console in front of her, lost in thought. Her past seemed far away now, like a distant memory that no longer had control over her. Yes, the battles, the pain, and the loss had shaped her, but they no longer dictated who she was. She had chosen to move forward, not out of obligation, but because she realized that living in the past was holding her back from the future she could build. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Orion's presence had become something she could sense, a quiet assurance that reminded her she wasn't alone. He sat down next to her, his gaze following hers out toward the stars. They both sat in silence for a moment, content with the quiet companionship they had built. "You know," Yalara said softly, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about the future. It's not something I ever thought about before. I was always too focused on surviving, on getting through the day. But now, I think I'm ready for something more. Orion turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. What do you think that something more looks like? Yellara paused, taking a deep breath. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was starting to understand that it wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about being open to the possibilities, to the opportunities that life was offering her. I think it's about creating something, she said thoughtfully. Maybe it's not a grand mission or a perfect life, but something real, something I can build with others. With you. Orion's smile widened, warmth in his eyes. I'd like that, Yellara. We could create something together, something that's ours. The thought felt right, as if it had always been meant to happen. Yellara had spent so long running, fighting, surviving, but now she could see a future that didn't require her to fight anymore. It was a future where she could contribute, heal, and love, not out of necessity, but out of choice, and she could do it with Orion by her side. As they sat there, looking out at the endless expanse of space, Yellara realized that the universe was full of unknowns, but it didn't have to be something to fear. The unknown could be full of promise of new beginnings. She was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to embrace it, to carve out her place in it. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer had the power to control her. Whatever comes next, Yellara said, her voice steady and certain, we'll face it together. And maybe, just maybe, it won't be so bad. Orion reached over and placed a hand on hers, his touch gentle but firm. Together, he agreed. For the first time in a long while, Yellara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to build. And with Orion at her side, she knew that whatever challenges came their way, they could face them, one step at a time. The journey ahead was unknown, but it was theirs to navigate. And that was all she needed to know.